If you have our Bibles, going up to Romans 11. Oh. Oh dear. Hannah told me to say, well, she didn't tell me to say this, but I think she wants me to, that Tuesday, so the girls' night had to be moved the first time, and then we had to move it to the 18th, which would be Thursday, but then we found out that clubs have informal on Thursday, and they find out who wins, and so I figured we probably shouldn't do that day either, because y'all are going to be busy all the time, so we're going to do Tuesday at 8, in here, this is the girls' night, so we'll post about it, well, Hannah, we'll post about it later, and you'll hear about it again, but I'm just going to let you know, I guess, like, so, okay. Yeah, you're welcome. I'm proud of myself. Alright, chapter 11. So we have come to the end of this 9 through 11 section that we've been in for a little bit now. And the main thing that we've been talking about is the assurance of the gospel in chapters 9 through 11. That's been, with the whole theme of Romans being the gospel, chapters 9 through 11 has been assurance of it. I'm sorry, not assurance, the defense of it. Excuse me. The defense of the gospel. And so it's been, people are questioning, has God not been faithful to his promises? Is God not faithful to Israel anymore? And so Paul has had to defend that and talk about it from chapters 9 through 11. It's been one extended argument. So, and remember, the main thing that we're trying to figure out here and that we're trying to determine is who is Israel. In chapter 9, verse 6, he says, but it is not as though the word of God has failed, for not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel. So there's a distinction he's making. Not all who belong to Israel, the country, belong to Israel, the people who God is faithful to and who is saved. And so there's a distinction, and we're trying to figure out who is this Israel today. We're going to come to that conclusion, or maybe tomorrow at coffee. We'll have coffee tomorrow if you want to go. I'll post about it. So, we'll start verse 1. Verses 1 through, 1 through 6? Okay. So, this is the climax of Paul's argument that we're about to read in chapter 11. This is like what we've been building up to. Here's the punch. Paul's about to give us all the answers and give us a nice metaphor to tie it up in a bow also. So, verses 1 through 6. Abigail, you want to read that?
I say then, has God cast away his people? Certainly not, for I also am an Israelite, of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not cast away his people, whom he foreknew. Or do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah, how he pleads with God against Israel, saying, Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what does the divine response say to him? I have reserved for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Even so then, at this present time there is a remnant according to the election of grace. And if by grace, then it is no longer of works, otherwise grace is no longer grace. But if it is of works, it is no longer grace, otherwise work is no longer work.
I got confusion there at the end.
Yeah.
Thank you. I know. A little bit of a tongue twister. Okay. So let's look at some things. We have this first phrase here. He says, I ask. And we can kind of connect that. So remember, we're trying to, as many times as we can, we're trying to connect what Paul says in this whole letter, but especially in this argument in chapters 9 through 11, because it's all one argument. We don't really want to divide it up by chapters, because Paul didn't. So, he says, I ask, and that kind of connects us back to chapter 10, verse 18, where he says, but I ask, have they not heard? And then in chapter 10, verse 19, he says, but I ask, did Israel not understand? Well, then he gets into chapter 11, verse 1, and he says, I ask, has God rejected his people? And so this is the whole climax, the main part of the argument. Has God rejected his people? So, and it's going to eventually connect to chapter 11, verse 11 as well. He says, by no means. Remember chapter 9, verse 6, what we just read earlier. Not all who belong to Israel are Israel. And that means that there is a distinction and God is faithful to that Israel. And so, he says, by no means. He says, I myself am an Israelite. Well, why would Paul feel the need to say this? Well, because he's saying, I'm an apostle, I'm a Christian, and I'm also an Israelite, like, of the tribe of Benjamin. And so he's saying, I am his people. Like, God hasn't rejected me, and so God hasn't rejected you just for being an Israelite. And so that's obviously not what it is. God has not fully and totally rejected, we'll say, ethnic Israel. Remember, we'll say this a few times today. When I say ethnic Israel, I'm referring to, like, I was born an Israelite, I am ethnic Israel. And so that is what I'm saying. As opposed to, Paul makes this distinction in chapter 9, verse 6. Not all who belong to Israel are Israels, right? So there's an ethnic Israel, and there is a I am God's, and I'm called Israel. And so, when I say ethnic Israel, I'm referring to people who are born in Israel. All right. He says God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. So what does that mean? We've talked about this before. I'm going to ask a few questions today because there's some challenging things that we get to, and I want to make sure we're all following along. What does it mean when it says that God foreknew someone? We've talked about this at least once, maybe twice. So we typically think of it as like an information thing, like God knows this or that. God knows everything. But I think that this is a relational thing. Like God knows you. He knows his people. He may not know, or he's not necessarily saying, I know exactly who's going to be in my people. But he's saying, I know that this is my plan, and I know that these people are who is going to be saved, and I know relationally you. And so this use of foreknew or foreknowledge is used in Amos 3:2. It's also used in other places, even in Romans. And so this is like a relational knowledge. So he says, do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah? So this instance is found in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 1 through 18. And I want to ask you this before I put the rest of it up on the screen. So the main premise here is, the main question is, has God rejected his people? And so he's trying to make this argument to say, no, God hasn't rejected his people. And he uses this instance with Elijah that we've read. Why? Why does he use Elijah? How does this story benefit his case?
Elijah thought that God had rejected his people, or that he was the only one left.
Yeah? But what was the case? What is true?
It wasn't true.
It wasn't true. There were 7,000 people that God says, I kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So there is a remnant. Well, it seems that everyone is evil, and everyone has rejected God. There are some who God has not rejected because they have not rejected him. They've been a remnant. So, are we good?
What's the scripture referencing green?
1 Kings chapter 19, verses 1 through 18. Sorry.
No, you're good.
I was like, what is wrong with the screen? Okay. Yes, that's exactly right. All right, so let's put the rest of it up here. So Elijah's story shows that the present rejection of the Jews, like the Jews rejecting God, this is not a foreign concept, and it's not even unique to the present. God has persisted in his faithfulness to Israel by always recognizing the remnant. He always recognizes the ones who serve him. Those are never the ones who are counted as guilty. So God preserves the remnant then, and what Paul is saying is he's going to continue to do so. He will continue to preserve and be faithful to the remnant of people who are still serving him. And so Paul makes this comparison. There's still a faithful people, a faithful remnant of people, who God is faithful toward. And he uses this phrase, so too at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. And so Paul is emphasizing here that God's faithfulness is not changed by based on man's merit. It is not man earning God's grace. It is God choosing to show grace. And so it's not a merit-based salvation. It is, and it was, God's gracious choice to show mercy to the remnant. It always has been. They follow God and they serve Him. Well, God graciously chooses to show mercy to them because they're following Him. And He always does that because He's faithful to the promise that He made. So, verse 6. If it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. And we kind of get this idea in Romans chapter 9, verses 6 through 29. It's kind of an extended section. But in it, it specifically talks about, remember, God chose Jacob over Esau in the womb. And Paul even makes the important point. He emphasizes it. They didn't do anything. They were in the womb. Like, they didn't do anything, but God chose Jacob over Esau. It was a gracious selection, and it was not based on works at all because they hadn't done anything. They were in the womb. And so God chooses who He shows mercy to or grace to based on His own plan for salvation history leading up to now. And that's what we see in Romans chapter 9 to 11. Well, we'll continue on. Verses 7 through 10. Dadams, can you read for me 7 through 10?
What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened, as it is written. God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see, and bend their backs forever.
Okay. So he asks another question. He says, what then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. So, question 1, well, this is not a question 1. We're talking about Israel as a whole nation here. Israel has failed to obtain what it was seeking. Question, what was Israel seeking? When it says they failed to obtain it, what is it that they're trying to obtain? Think about through the whole book of Romans. We have these Jews who are seeking to obtain something and they can't get it. Righteousness. Because they find righteousness in the law. And that's not where you find it. It's always found in faith. From the time of Abraham, from before that, but we see it illustrated with Abraham in Romans chapter 4, all the way through time, all the way through the history of the Israelites, righteousness has always been found in faith. So Paul asks, what then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. It was seeking righteousness. But the elect obtained it, and the rest were hardened. So before I put stuff on the screen, what does this mean that the rest were hardened? Like, does God just stop people from following Him? What's He saying? How have we seen hardened Jews before this? Maybe I'll ask that. We'll work our way there.
Hearts being hardened.
Hearts being hardened? Whose?
Pharaoh specific.
Pharaoh specifically in chapter 9, right? And then can we think of anybody else whose heart was hardened, or maybe a group of people? Paul says that the Jews' hearts were hardened in chapter 9 also. In that same kind of section, he uses Pharaoh as an example and says, when Pharaoh rejected me, well, then I hardened his heart because he chose to reject me. And so now I'm going to use him to show mercy to someone else. I showed mercy to Egypt when I sent them Joseph. They prospered. When Pharaoh turned his back on me, then I hardened his heart and I showed mercy to the Israelites. I brought them out. Well, now the Israelites have rejected God, and they've rejected Him over and over and over. They're living in this state of rejection. Well, God's going to harden them, and He's going to show mercy to the Gentiles in the same way that He did with Pharaoh. That's what He says in chapter 9. And so this idea of hardening, this is not God stopping an entire nation of people from serving him. But this is handing them over to what they already want. Remember in chapter 1? I bring this up a lot because it's stuck in my head after I studied it. That in chapter 1 where it says that God gave people over to their lusts and their desires of the world and what they want. It says that God gave them over, a deliberate handing over. You want to go that way? And you want to live that way? Okay, do it. Go. Well, in the same way, in a similar way, Israel's rejected God. God says, okay, no, pushes you toward that way. Go for it. Live that way. And in your rejection, I'm going to show mercy to someone else. And so he says the elect obtained it. The remnant, those who have always followed God, God didn't harden their heart and say, no, you're a part of Israel, so let me just harden you too, even though you were serving me. No. He says, you're the remnant, the ones who have followed me. Okay, you've obtained it. You obviously know what it looks like to serve me. But all of these people who are trying to serve it through the law, serve me through the law, and all these people who missed Jesus, I'm hardening their heart, and they'll be over here. And I'll show mercy to the remnant, because the remnant is the one who serves me. And so the elect, the remnant, who he foreknew, and who he predestined, who he chose by grace, these are the people who obtained righteousness, what they all are seeking. They're the only ones that know how to do it, because they do it by faith. And everybody else is hardened. So let's put some things up here. This is all just things that we've said. So we get to verse 8. We get into verse 8. And verse 8 is a kind of a combination of verses. Paul obviously knows the scriptures very well. And so sometimes he will kind of take two different passages and just kind of plug them together because he can. He knows it well, and he's getting at the same idea. So he uses Deuteronomy 29:4 and he uses Isaiah 29:10, kind of in one, almost as if it's one verse. And well, before that, let's talk about this. In what we're about to read, verses 8 through 10, Paul uses the three divisions of like the Hebrew Bible or the Hebrew canon to make this point and to provide evidence for his argument. And so he uses the law with Deuteronomy, he uses the prophets with Isaiah, and he uses what they call the writings, which would be like Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and stuff like that. And so he uses Psalms as well. And so these are like the three main, it's kind of like how we have like the Gospels and then we have like Paul's letters. Or like in the Old Testament we have like the Torah and then we have this and this. Similar for them. They had three main divisions of the Hebrew Bible. And Paul uses an example from each one to prove this point and to give evidence for the fact that God hardens the hearts of those who don't listen. And that they were going to be hardened. And so, let's talk about verse 8. In verse 8, he says he gave them a spirit of stupor, I guess. It's like deep sleep, basically. And there's a couple of things here. One, in Deuteronomy, we'll talk about the context of Deuteronomy. Moses is, right before they cross the Jordan River and they enter the land of Canaan, he's giving them the rundown of their history. He's telling them what they need to be focused on. He's telling them, this is probably what you're going to do, and because you're going to do this, you're going to fail in this way. But he encourages them to live this way. And so, he uses this idea before they cross the Jordan, that they cannot understand. Moses uses this idea that they can't understand, the Israelites can't understand, or really even fully appreciate the great acts of God that God has done for them. And he says that your eyes would not even see. So you don't even understand all of the things that God has done for you to bring you to this point, obviously, or else they would have lived probably differently. And so he uses this passage in Deuteronomy. And what I found interesting is, in Deuteronomy 29:4, it says that the Lord has not given you a mind to understand. And there's really a subtle difference here. I just found it interesting. That Moses says that God has not given you a mind to understand. And Paul, he says the same thing, but he kind of changes up some words and says that God gave them a spirit of stupor, a similar idea. God gave them a spirit where they wouldn't understand. And so I thought that this was interesting because it seems like God, that Paul is trying to emphasize, he kind of just flips a word here, and he's trying to emphasize that this is God deliberately doing this. This is not like God didn't give you this for this purpose, like Moses was trying to do, because his purpose was different. Paul is saying, God gave you a spirit of stupor. He gave you a spirit to not understand, because you already don't want to anyways. You haven't been looking. Your eyes haven't been opened. So let me just keep them closed, and I'll just do something else. So, Paul's trying to emphasize this. This is intentional, I think, this little changing of words. And so we see that the Jews in the present, this is what Paul's trying to get at, are in a spiritual stupor. They're in a great sleep. And they've got their eyes closed to the acts of salvation history that God is performing and that he's doing. They don't have any idea what's happening. So, verse 10, or verses 9 and 10. David says, and keep in mind here, that David is praying on the downfall of his persecutors here. This is a reference to Psalm 69, 22, and 23. And he says this verse, let their table become a snare and a trap and a stumbling block and a retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened so they cannot see and bend their backs forever. I read on this, and it seems like the main thing that we need to get out of it is that Paul uses this idea, let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see. The rest of the verse, it may not be as applicable because it's just a psalm that Paul is using here. But what he's trying to get at is that people's eyes can be darkened and God can do it. He says, let their eyes be darkened so they can't see. And God's capable of it. And David asked him to do it for his enemies. Well, Paul uses this idea and saying, this is what's happening to the rest. Remember in the verse before, he says, the rest were hardened in verse 7. And so he's saying this idea of their eyes being darkened and they can't see, this is what's happening to those who are being hardened, who are the rest. And so the big idea in this section is Israel's rejection is not total. Israel's rejection is not complete. God's rejection of Israel and his hardening of their heart, it is not all of Israel, because there is a remnant who God has kept, who is faithful, and who has not been hardened. But those who have not been faithful are hardened. And so while God has rejected Israel ethnically, as a country, God has rejected Israel, it doesn't mean that his rejection is total. It's not complete. And so that's important. And so then we're going to see something else in this next section about God's rejection of Israel, and really, you can swap the words, and Israel's rejection of God. We're going to see some more in the next section. So, verses 11 and 12. Kendall, can you read that for me?
I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Certainly not, or through their fall to provoke them to jealousy. Salvation has come to the Gentiles. Now if their fall is riches for the world, and their failure riches for the Gentiles, how much more their failures? How much more their fullness?
Thank you. All right. So, verse 11 says, so I ask, again, connecting what we talked about there at the beginning. Chapter 10, verse 18, chapter 10, verse 19, chapter 11, verse 1. And he's connecting the thought. Chapter 11, verse 11. So I ask, same words. Did they stumble in order that they might fall? There's a few things we need to talk about. One is that Paul has this, I consider it like a three-stage process, basically. And this is what I mean. So, he says, he will do this often, and I'll point it out to you every time. He will talk about the hardening or the casting out or the cutting off of the Jews, and then he'll say, I took that mercy and I showed it to the Gentiles, and this is how. And then I'm going to take that mercy and I'm going to show it to everybody. And he says that in like a three-stage kind of phrase or process every time. And so this one, he says it here. By no means, rather through their trespass. So this is the Jews, they've been cast out. They did something bad. There is their trespass. Salvation has come to the Gentiles. Okay, so now the mercy has shifted. The mercy is no longer showed to Israel as a country, but now the mercy is available to the Gentiles. So let's make Israel jealous, skip down a bit. How much more will their full inclusion mean? Now it's everybody. Everybody is going to be able to receive God's mercy now. And so I'll try to point that out every time he does it, but he's going to do it like multiple times. All right. So let's talk about some things. One, the word fall. He says, did they stumble in order that they might fall? And this is not like I tripped and I got back up. This is like I tripped and I broke like all my bones and I laid there forever. It's something like this is an irreversible final rejection. And so I don't think that this is God causing Israel to permanently stumble or to permanently fall. And this is what Paul is asking. Well, did they stumble? Did God harden their hearts so that they might just fall forever and just be laying on the ground there forever and never get back up? By no means is what he says. Rather, through their trespass, through their sin, salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. Now let's talk about this, because this is interesting. We get this word jealous here. So, what is God trying to say? Like, is God trying to just make the Israelites jealous? Is this like a bad relationship kind of thing where, what's happening? Before I go along with that analogy, though, why is God trying to make the Israelites jealous?
To see what they're missing out on.
Okay, yeah. We're gonna keep going on that.
Well, just because like you've done this, I mean, it's literally like a child. You take away a toy. Oh, I don't have that toy anymore. I'm mad. Well, there's a reason why you took away that. You need to you need to learn your lesson from it.
And not even only that. To stick with that, not even only that the toy got taken away, but the toy got given to like little Tommy over here. It's like, how did little Tommy get the toy? Like, I want the toy. And this is the kind of the idea. That's a good illustration. It's kind of the idea we're getting at here. We typically think about jealousy as like a really bad, terrible thing. But in the Bible, envy is. Jealousy is a bit different, and it's not always bad. God considers himself to be jealous. A consuming fire, actually, Deuteronomy 4:24, I think. And so, this is not a bad thing. This is God saying that his goal in the stumbling here, what we talked about, did they stumble in order that they might fall, the Israelites? God's goal in the stumbling was the movement of salvation to the nations, to all. Everybody can receive it now, all the Gentiles. So that Israel can see how the blessing is obtained, and they would be motivated to seek it. They say, whoa, the blessing shifted over here to the Gentiles. And maybe this is what wakes up their hardening. These Israelites who thought that they've been obtaining righteousness, and they've been seeking it, but they never found it because they've done it the wrong way. And they've never really sought God. Well, these people who are going to see the Gentiles receiving mercy and say, how did they get that? How are these people God's people now? Well, what does this covenant look like? And then maybe that jealousy will lead them to God. I think it's similar to the reason that we disfellowship, in a way. Brooke had that.
That's what I was thinking the whole time we're reading this. This is like disfellowship. Like it's for this purpose. You're good.
Wavelength. So, dude, that tenant and this. So, yes, so it's similar to disfellowship in that when someone is living in sin and they are openly defying God and they don't want to be a part of the church anymore, well, the church recognizes it. Okay, you want to be a part of the church anymore? Well, okay, we'll just create some separation, create some distance. You don't want to be in this fellowship anyways. You're not. And so let's just recognize it. It's out there. And so when this happens, well, the goal is not so that you just stay away forever. The goal is so that you realize, oh, like I missed that. I want to be a part of that. And maybe you get a little bit jealous that all these other people get to be a part of the church and they get to be cared for and loved as a church body. And they get to do so many great things together and I don't because I'm not a part of that anymore. And you come back. It's very similar, not the same, but it's a very similar idea here. Is that these Israelites see that the mercy has shifted and wake up and open their eyes and go that way, toward God. And so that's what this means. This is not a bad jealousy, terrible thing. This is like a righteous jealousy. I want you to be so jealous that you seek me and you do it the right way, not through the law. So, since I was made Israel jealous, Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, then, you could add, then how much more will their full inclusion be? So God's mercy shifts. Israel's rejection leads to mercy for the Gentiles, which should lead to mercy for all people. Okay. Next verse. Yep, okay. Verses 13 through 16. Katie, can you read that? Verse 13. You can't read that part? Okay, never mind. All right. Lauren, can you read that?
Yes, I can. For I speak to you, Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry, if by any means I may provoke to jealousy those who are of my flesh, and save some of them. Did you say through 16?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. For if their being cast away is the reconciling of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? For if the first fruit is holy, the lump is also holy, and if the root is holy, so are the branches.
Thank you. Okay. Let's put some writing up on here. So, now we get a new addressee. Paul is addressing a new group of people. And he says, now I'm speaking to you, Gentiles. It's almost like okay, your turn. So he says, now I'm speaking to you. I've been going on these Jews this whole time, and all these people who call themselves Jews, and part of Israel. Well, now, let me talk to you. So he says, now I'm speaking to you, Gentiles. Verses 13 and 14. The main idea here is Paul's ministry is focused on the Gentiles. We've known that. Like this is the assignment he's been given. He says, inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry. Now I think this magnifying of his ministry, I think it's just kind of the idea of like, I give it everything. It is incredibly important to me. It is my sole focus, is ministering and being an apostle to the Gentiles. So he says, I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them. So Paul works very hard in his ministry to the Gentiles, but he holds out hope that the Jews will become jealous and that he indirectly, by being an apostle to the Gentiles, will make the Jews jealous and save them too. His focus is here, but he hopes that his efforts will even reach out to the Jews over here. And I think that's what he's trying to say here. And so the idea remains that the Jews are not just cast out, and the Israelites, or whatever you want to say, they're not just cast out like, okay, get out of here, I'm never going to talk to you again. That is not at all the case, and it's not God's mentality, nor is it Paul's here. So then we get into verse 15. Oh, we have the thing again. And this one is even more obvious because they're stacked right on top of each other. In verse 15, he says, for if their rejection, all right, mercy's gone from the Israelites, means the reconciliation of the world, mercy is shifted to someone else, to the rest of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? This is everybody. Their acceptance. Because remember, he's talking to Gentiles now. And so he says, that's someone else. He's talking about the Jews. And so we get this shifting of mercy. Now, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? This is everybody. So let's talk about some terms here. He says, for their rejection means the reconciliation of the world. I have on here a reference to Romans chapter 5, verse 11, where reconciliation is talked about. The idea is God's act of bringing sinners to himself into a peaceful relationship. And so this is a reconciliation of the whole world. Anyone who wants to serve God, anyone who wants to take part in his mercy and become a part of the remnant that is God's people, well, they can now. And God can bring them to himself. But when we talk about the world, and it says reconciliation to the world, we're talking about Gentiles. They now have access to this. And of course, like I just said, this is Gentiles who are faithful. This isn't just everybody, not everybody that's being saved. This isn't talking about universal salvation. But anybody can be saved. Anyone can be faithful and receive God's mercy. So, he says, their rejection means the reconciliation of the world. What would their acceptance mean but life from the dead. And I think there's kind of an interesting connection here. I think that when we see riches for the world, I think oftentimes you can maybe make or at least be thinking about the resurrection. And so riches for the world is talked about in chapter 11, 12, what we just read, chapter 9, verse 23, and even in chapter 8, verses 18 through 30. And it always seems to be pointing toward the resurrection. And we see the resurrection talked about, I might have it up here, maybe not, in chapter 5, verse 17, 18, and 21. And so resurrection is talked about multiple times. But it seems that whenever Paul writes something about the riches for the world, or the riches of God's glory, it seems to oftentimes point toward the resurrection. And so here, he's saying, where'd we go? Verse 12. He says, if their trespass means riches for the world, everybody is going to receive these riches for the world. Everybody can. How much more will their full inclusion be? Well, you move on a bit. And he says, well, this riches from the world, it means life from the dead. That's what it ultimately is going to lead to. And so, I guess I just thought it was like a cool thought and a cool connection to make. But we also have a thought, maybe not a direct reference, but a thought that goes toward Ezekiel 37, 11 through 14. And that's something you can study on your own, but it's just a reference to the resurrection of Israel returning from exile. And so he kind of portrays it as like Israel is dead and they're in exile apart from home. Well, God's going to raise them back up and they're going to come home. And so he kind of uses similar ideas here in this text. But anyways, we'll move on and we'll just talk about this and set up ourselves for tomorrow for coffee. So, in verse 16, he gives two metaphors. The first metaphor is, if the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And this is kind of an idea from Numbers chapter 15, verses 17 through 21. So after they entered the promised land, the Israelites, after they entered the promised land, the people were to offer from, quote, the first fruits of the lump of dough. It was the idea. And so the Israelites were supposed to go offer this as soon as they got into the promised land. And we can't look too much into these metaphors. There are some things that we're not going to be able to say like, well, this is definitely this, and this is definitely this, and this is definitely this. But the idea here for the bread and metaphor, or the dough, is that the holiness of the first fruits spreads to the whole lump. You know, oftentimes when we hear about leaven, and when we talk about leavening the whole lump, it means that it's spreading to all of it. And so the idea here is that the holiness of the first fruits, how great those are, it spreads holiness for everybody. And so he's talking about like Jews and Gentiles here is the idea. It's like the holiness that the Jews had first, it spreads to everybody. But then he's about to get into another metaphor, and I should clarify, it's not even that the holiness that the Jews had, but most people think it's the holiness that their like fathers had, like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And so he's kind of talking about the beginning of Israel. He says the holiness of those men and those people is spreading to everybody. Anyways, I'm on this metaphor for too long. Let's talk about the main one here. He says, and if the root is holy, so are the branches. So here, we're getting into, and we're beginning the main metaphor that he's about to be on for a while. Is that there's a tree. And some people are grafted into the tree and made a part of it, and some people are already naturally a part of it. Some people are branches that be cut off because they don't want to be part of the tree anymore. They're not acting like it. And some people are being added on. So, we'll talk about that a lot more, I think, on coffee, in coffee tomorrow at 6:30 at Starbucks. But, here's what we can talk about with this. One is the tree imagery in the Old Testament. It often points toward a kingdom. And it usually talks about God's kingdom, oftentimes, if you're getting like big tree metaphors or ideas. And you see it a lot in Isaiah. The big idea here in this metaphor, or at least in this section, is that if the source is holy, so is the product. With these two things that we see here. If what you're receiving nourishment from, what is your source? If that's holy, well, your product should also be holy. Just like if you plant a seed for a certain fruit, well, you're going to reap that fruit, not any other fruit. Similar idea. If your seed, if your source is holy, your product will be holy as well. And so we'll talk about this quickly. Two things. One, the root. We're gonna see the root a lot. We'll talk about this tomorrow. I think people try to say like this is definitely the root or that's definitely the root. I don't think that you can. But I think that this root here, and we'll talk about this in coffee, and I'll tell you why. I think that this root here is Jesus. Most people will say it's like Abraham or the patriarchs. I don't think that makes as much sense. I'll tell you why tomorrow. But he says that the root is holy, so are the branches. And so let me talk about this metaphor real quick and then we'll be done. I read this and I think it helps us make the most sense of this whole tree thing that we're about to talk about for the next several verses tomorrow. The tree idea is more like a family tree that you're grafting into and taking out. Because what we've been talking about pretty much for this whole part of Romans is the seed of Abraham. We want to be Abraham's offspring, and Abraham's offspring are those who are faithful, who share Abraham's faith. Right? It's not because you've done this act of the law or because you follow this way. It's because you have faith. That's what makes you a son or daughter of Abraham. And so we're really kind of following this family tree. And Paul has kind of laid it out for us in chapter 9 a bit. And so what we're about to talk about tomorrow at coffee is that this tree is something that Gentiles are added onto, and that people who actually belong to the family are being taken out of. Are being taken out of. Because the main characteristic of the tree is faith. If you want to be a part of this family, well, you have to share this faith. And those who aren't sharing the faith are getting pruned. And those who share the faith, they're getting adopted. So that's what we'll talk about tomorrow at coffee. Okay. Good talk. Britt.
Thank you.
Oh, of course. Hey, I'm making books.
So funny.
I thought so.
I was just thinking, I was like, dude, you're preaching about time.
I have almost always preached at that time, but this time I'm stepping up my game to make up for how bad this lesson was. Really.
Fair enough.
So I got back, man, this is horrible. Well, at least
That's a nice
exactly.
I was worried if you were eating up here. It's like, look at he's chewing.
Yeah. Because I didn't eat earlier, and I'm preaching, and I don't want to get light today.
Don't want to hit the ground.
Exactly. So I was like, I'll eat during this time, people just have to forgive me.
If you pass out again, I'm literally just gonna sit there and be like,
I don't know.
yeah,
Dude, you're gonna be right up there. Trying to save me.